It makes me think of another woman that was coming out for individual sessions, and she was struggling so much with loss in her life, and resentments in her life. She was using alcohol. She didn't feel like she belonged to anything. She felt alone. One of the main things that she was working on in this particular session, I remember, was her anger. And her fear of when her anger would show up, that people would run away, would leave. And she was fearful that if she started to work on her anger out in the pasture, that the horses would all run away, and she would be alone again with her anger. And so we wanted her to explore, she wanted to explore more her anger and how that looked and felt. And so we asked her to create a something physical, using props and different things she could find in the space, to build a physical representation of what her anger consisted of, what it looked like. Again, to get it out of her head and hear, so she could step back from it and to see it maybe in a different perspective. And so she gathered up all sorts of things, wood blocks with terms, words on it that said, you know, things like resentment, hurt, grief, loss, addiction, different things like that she put in this pile. She had noodles and ropes and construction cones, and with so many things. She just piled all these things up in it. And she had one small stuffed animal that was a little bear. And she said, this is self. And she put that underneath the pile of all the stuff. She even went and got some manure from out in the pasture and loaded that in this pile. And she said, she stood back, she said, oh my gosh, that's my anger. It's a mess. It's all intertwined. There's all this crap. And I'm lost and covered up from this anger. As she was building that anger, is really interesting. We were watching the entire space for shifts and patterns and things that are unique in the horses and what they're doing. And they were a ways out in the pasture, but once she started building this representation of her anger, they turned and they started facing her, and they stopped grazing, and they just had eyes on her and her interaction with this anger. And they were still out a ways, and she turned to us and she said, I'm so angry with my anger. And we said, well, what do you want to do with that anger that you're feeling with your anger? And she said, I just want to take it apart. I want to just get rid of it. I want to dismantle it. And we said, you know, okay. So she stepped forward, she stepped into it. And if you can envision, there's this pile of all the stuff tangled together. She started moving it apart, at first slowly and just a little at a time, and then she just got into it, and she was crying and she was swearing and she was throwing things, and she was just dismantling her anger. And she got to the bottom of it and found herself, and she sat down crying and just sitting there, her anger dismantled and just sitting with herself. And she looked up, and every single one of those horses had moved in and had their heads low and were just breathing slowly and quietly all around her. And she said, oh my gosh, I finally feel like I found myself. I've gotten to the bottom of my anger, and I feel like I found my herd. I'm a part of something. It's just so powerful when you think about how we could tell her those things. We could cognitively, you know, engage with her. Yet through that physical movement of dismantling it, of finding herself there in metaphor and not, literally, she found herself there. And then how those horses just knew to come in and to give her that feedback. And that feeling of she was part of something. She wasn't alone. So cool.
Yeah, I think that physical representation, putting that in that physical space, especially working with clients of trauma, how often we see clients just spending time with the horses or petting the horses or something, and relaying that it feels like they're connecting to themselves, that that horse becomes themselves, and that they're reconnecting to themselves again, and just that actual physicalness of that process.